Hi everyone, Merle Goldstein here. I know that some of you will be spending holidays with family. Um, in the best of circumstances, this tends to be a very pleasant, enjoyable experience, and unfortunately for some people, family members can be quite triggering. Sometimes even family members that a person really loves or gets along with, when there's just too much time together or too much going on, people can get kind of triggered. So I wanted to make a short video and talk about something called emotional contagion that often happens in families and in interactions when there's a lot of stress or pressure or overstimulation. And sometimes this can lead to cycles of interaction where people end up escalating each other unintentionally and really reacting to each other in a way that just gets louder and louder or more and more intense and could start to feel kind of out of control at a certain point. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that. Emotional contagion really means it's really referring to when two people end up reacting to each other's emotions in a way that makes the emotion almost contagious from one person to the other. So where the emotions get really passed back and forth, and it's like whatever tension or stress is going on for one person gets transferred to the other person, and they both end up triggering each other over and over again and escalating each other. And this happens more in some families than in others. And it happens more for some people than for other people. So there are some people that have a very sensitive nervous system, and their brain goes into fight or flight, or really has a very strong reaction to other people's emotions, or to hearing any sort of threat signal in the other person's voice. So if the other person sounds a little bit anxious, a little overwhelmed, a little pressured, a little angry, there are some people that have very strong reactions to this, and it causes them to have a fight or flight response, to either get angry themselves or to get anxious themselves. But basically the person is reacting, right? They're not hearing the other person. They're not seeing the situation for what it is, but they're having a strong reaction to the emotions in the other person. And usually what happens is people end up reacting to each other, and the reactions just get louder and louder and more intense. And people really can escalate each other. And sometimes this can happen from something that objectively speaking seems pretty subtle. There are some people that will hear even the slightest edge in our voice, or the slightest tone that has anxiety in it, or a little bit of pressure, as if you're yelling at them, or as if there's a big emergency, right? Their brain sort of starts to scream, emergency, emergency, right? And the person really reacts to it. And we know that there are a few different reactions that a person can have when they feel threatened, and one of them is anger, and one of them is fear or wanting to get away from the situation. And often what happens is some people feel frightened and they express that as anger, or they go into a protest response. But it's really just their way of showing that they feel alarmed or threatened in some way. And this can often happen when somebody actually blames another person for a situation where the other person is actually hurting in some way or threatened in some way, but it evokes a reaction in the other person, and the only way they know to express it is anger. So an example would be if a kid falls down and gets hurt, and the parent either feels guilty or they feel alarmed or scared, and instead of calming themselves down and responding to the child, they start yelling at the kid. Why didn't you watch where you were going? Right? And then the kid starts crying harder, and then the parent yells even more. I told you shouldn't have gone there. Why did you do it? And the kid starts crying louder, right? And they're both escalating each other. But really what's happening here is the kid is hurt, the parent is afraid, and instead of the parent realizing that they're afraid and managing their reactions, the parent is actually yelling and screaming at the kid, right? They're reacting themselves with a defensive response or an emergency response, and this just kind of escalates things. It can also happen in a very subtle way. It could be something really small, like you're preparing to leave the house by a certain time, and let's say everyone's supposed to leave at 6, and now it's 6:05, and you're still waiting for someone. And maybe it's your child, maybe it's your partner, right? You say to the person, I thought we were supposed to leave by 6. You hear there's like a little edge in my tone? And the other person might have an extreme reaction to that. I'm coming, I'm coming. Why are you screaming at me? I'm not screaming you. I'm just telling you we were supposed to leave at 6. I'm coming. Why are you getting so impatient, right? And they both escalate each other. And really what's happening is the person who said, why aren't you coming? We were supposed to leave by 6, right? Or we were supposed to leave by 6, has a little tiny edge in their tone, or a big edge. And the other person's responding to that. Their brain is reacting to that, and they're starting to feel threatened. And then they start to yell, right? Because they don't know what else to do. And then the person who said it thinks they just made a very simple comment, right? All I said was we should leave by 6. I'm just asking you if you're ready, right? But they think the other person's overreacting or having an overblown reaction. So now they get reactive to that. And the next thing you know, both people are just escalating each other, and they're both sort of yelling at each other. And this could happen between parents and children, right? Where let's say a parent is trying to tell a child something, and maybe they sound a little nervous or pressured or frustrated, and the kid hears it as like the parent's yelling at them. So then the kid starts to cry, or the kid starts to yell, and then the parent yells even louder, right? And before you know it, everyone's having an emotional meltdown, and they're all just sort of triggering each other, and nobody really knows who started it, right? It's a cycle. It can happen between two spouses. It can happen with a parent and a child and their parent. It can happen really between siblings. It can happen with anybody. But the point is that there's one person's brain is reacting to the other person's tone in a way that is a threat response. And then that person either starts to yell or wants to get out of the situation, and that escalates the other person, and then the other person's tone continues to escalate, and then before you know it, they're both emotionally triggering each other, and they're getting into this cycle. So it's really important, if you start to notice this happening, or if you notice that this is a pattern for you. It could even happen sometimes between spouses or parent and child, where a person needs support. Like maybe the mother is feeling very overwhelmed by all the kids, and she says to her husband, I really need help, or I can't handle this. And instead of him giving her support, he gets anxious that she sounds anxious or overwhelmed, right? So he starts yelling at her. Well, I told you not to do X, Y, or Z, right? So he's kind of yelling, but really he's just anxious. And they're not really talking to each other. It's not like two calm, regulated brains talking to each other in that moment. It's really two people just reacting to each other. Right? And either person could break the cycle. If you notice that this tends to happen, or you're aware in the moment that it's happening, right? All you need to do is just slow down your voice, start to sound calm, talk more quietly, talk more slowly, try to speak in a way that's soothing, and the other person will regulate themselves. Or just regulate yourself, right? Just talk yourself through it. Okay, I'm having a reaction. We're just escalating each other. I'm going to calm down. I'm going to take a deep breath, right? Regulate yourself, regulate the other person, and break the cycle. It's hard to do it. It's especially hard if you needed support, or you're feeling anxious yourself, and you feel like the other person is making you feel more anxious, or is yelling at you, or is not able to be there for you, or if you're trying to talk to someone about something that you're worried about or that's bothering you, and you feel like they're making you feel worse. It's very hard not to just keep reacting, or try to start yelling at them, or say what you want to say louder and try to force them to hear you. But if two people are triggered at the same time, it's not going to work. And like I said, some people are very sensitive and other people are less sensitive. Some people's brains are able to detect even the slightest change in tone that represents that the other person is feeling anxious or a little emotional or frustrated, and their brain just goes into emergency mode as soon as that happens. And if you have a kid like that, or a spouse like that, or a family member like that, you're going to have to really be careful about learning how to regulate yourself and be very, very attuned to how your tone comes across to the other person, or you might end up triggering someone over and over again without realizing it, and getting into these cycles where two people end up just yelling at each other and really escalating each other in ways that are really like a pattern or a cycle of escalation that could be broken if one person or both people are able to be aware of what's going on and to see it for what it is, that it's not the other person is actually trying to yell at me or wants to yell at me, or it's not that the other person is angry at what I'm saying or taking it out of context, but it's really that both of our brains are just reacting right now. We're reacting to each other in a very sensitive way. And if you learn how to break the pattern of those reactions, then you could really create a lot of calm for the whole family. And you could also sort of predict ahead of time or plan ahead of time. If you know there's certain situations where there's usually tension or people get overwhelmed or they sound kind of pressured, if you prepare for that ahead of time or even talk to each other about it ahead of time, okay, look, we're going to be pressed for time. There's going to be a lot going on. We're going to be nervous. Let's try not to escalate each other. Let's try to stay calm. Let's try to talk to each other in a calm tone of voice. Let's try to remember that we're both doing our best. Neither of us is trying to upset the other person. And we're going to try not to have any reactions that are just going to create a negative cycle. And if you work on that, then it can often really calm things down, and it could stop people from triggering each other and getting into cycles that get out of control. And in this way, you can really take control of some of your interactions, and you can be able to understand that you might have on your hands a partner or a child or family member that has very, very sensitive nervous system and is very, very, very attuned to any feelings of threat in the environment and to any detection of some sort of threat signal in your tone of voice. And if they feel any vulnerability in you or that your emotions are out of control, they may have a strong reaction to that. And the best way to deal with that is to really try to regulate yourself when you're interacting with them and to see the reactions for what they are. They're not personal. It's not that they're intentionally trying to be difficult or take things out of context, but that it's just their brain, their amygdala is firing is sounding the fire alarm. And that you need to help them regulate, and you need to regulate yourself in the interactions with them. So I hope everyone can work on that this holiday. If you have a family member that gets dysregulated or gets very sensitive, if you can try to stay regulated yourself and help them regulate, then you might be able to have things go a little bit more smoothly than usual. I hope this was helpful. Drop me a line if you have any comments or questions at merlegoldstein@gmail.com. Take care, everyone. Good night.